In January 2026, Indonesia switched on a law that can send an unmarried couple to prison for sharing a hotel room. Not for stealing, not for violence, for love, or at least for sex outside of marriage. It sounds like something from a different century, and in many ways it is. But the surprising part isn't that this law exists. The surprising part is how Indonesia got here. Because for most of its modern history, this same nation was moving in the opposite direction. So how does a country go from loosening its grip on private life to tightening it again, all within 80 years? And more importantly, what does the newest chapter of this story tell us about where Indonesia is really heading? Stick around, because the ending of this story might be the most unexpected turn of all. Indonesia is the fourth most populous country on Earth, home to more Muslims than any other nation, and stitched together from more than 17,000 islands and hundreds of ethnic groups. That diversity means there has never been just one Indonesian attitude towards sex, marriage, or gender. There have always been many, layered on top of each other like sediment. Understanding how those layers formed helps explain not just Indonesia, but a pattern playing out across much of the developing world, where colonial law, religious revival, and modern globalization keep colliding over the same intimate questions. Over the next 18 minutes, we will travel from the final days of Dutch rule, through revolution, dictatorship, democratization, and the smartphone era, all the way to a law that took effect this very year, one of the newest and most consequential pieces of morality legislation anywhere in the world today. Along the way, we'll look at the numbers, the politics, and the ordinary people caught in the middle of a debate that is really about who gets to decide what happens in Indonesian bedrooms. To understand Indonesia in 1945, you have to understand that it was a country being born twice at once. Politically, it declared independence from the Netherlands, ending centuries of colonial rule. Culturally, it was inheriting a patchwork of traditions that predated the Dutch by 1,000 years or more. Long before European ships arrived, the archipelago was home to Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms, animist tribal societies, and, from around the 13th century onward, a wave of Islamic influence carried by traders from India and the Arabian Peninsula. Each of these traditions treated sexuality differently. In parts of Java and Bali, temple carvings and classical literature depicted the body and desire with a frankness that would surprise many people today. In matrilineal Minangkabau society in Sumatra, women held significant authority over property and marriage decisions. Inheritance passed down the female line, and a new husband traditionally moved into his wife's household rather than the other way around. In parts of Sulawesi, some indigenous Buddhist communities recognized more than two gender categories long before Western vocabulary around gender identity existed, assigning distinct social and ceremonial roles to each. Meanwhile, Islamic law, as it spread, brought its own frameworks around marriage, modesty, and family structure. And by the time of independence, the overwhelming majority of the population identified as Muslim. Even as local practice blended Islamic teaching with older animist and Hindu-Buddhist customs in a syncretic style scholars often call Kebatinan, or Javanese mysticism. The Dutch colonial administration layered a European legal code on top of all of this, importing a criminal code in 1918 that was, ironically, more permissive on private sexual conduct between adults than what would come centuries later, because Dutch colonial law was primarily concerned with maintaining order and control, not policing private morality. Adultery was a crime, but only under narrow conditions, and only if a spouse filed a complaint. Homosexual acts were only criminalized in cases involving a minor. Daily life for most Indonesians, though, wasn't dictated by this legal code so much as by local custom, known as adat, and by the increasing pull of Islamic teaching, particularly in more devout regions like Aceh, often described as the veranda of Mecca, because of its historic role as an entry point for Islamic scholarship into the archipelago. Marriages were typically arranged, often early, and virginity before marriage was expected of women in most communities, even as some regions maintained looser norms around premarital relationships, especially in Bali, where Hindu ritual life shaped very different expectations around courtship. Islamic courts, or Pengadilan Agama, handled marriage and divorce for Muslim Indonesians even under Dutch rule, creating a dual legal track, secular colonial law running alongside religious family law that would persist long after independence and still shapes Indonesia's legal system today. This was the foundation. A legal system from Europe, a moral compass increasingly shaped by Islam and centuries-old local customs, all overlapping uneasily, waiting for the pressures of independence to reshape them. The first major turning point didn't come from a bedroom, it came from a battlefield. Indonesia's War of Independence, fought between 1945 and 1949, forced the new nation to build institutions almost from scratch, and one of the earliest and most consequential was a unified marriage law, finally passed in 1974 after decades of debate. This law set a legal marrying age, required official registration of marriages, and, crucially, restricted the previously widespread practice of polygamy, requiring a man to get court permission and his existing wife's consent before taking another wife. For millions of Indonesian women, this was the first time the state had formally intervened in family life on their behalf. The law also set the minimum marriage age at 16 for women and 19 for men, a threshold that women's rights groups would spend the next 45 years campaigning to raise, arguing it still allowed for child marriage in practice, particularly in poorer rural regions where local religious leaders sometimes granted dispensations. It didn't end polygamy, and enforcement varied wildly between regions, but it created a legal precedent. Marriage was now a matter the state had a stake in, not just religious authorities or family elders. At the same time, the political climate of the 1965 to 1966 period cannot be separated from this story. General Suharto's rise to power, following a violent anti-communist purge that killed hundreds of thousands of people, ushered in more than 3 decades of authoritarian rule known as the New Order. Suharto's government promoted a state ideology built around the nuclear family, with women cast primarily as wives and mothers through a program called Dharma Wanita, which organized the wives of civil servants into a hierarchy that mirrored their husband's rank. Family planning, however, became one of the New Order's genuine successes. Beginning in the 1970s, the government launched an aggressive contraception campaign, and Indonesia's total fertility rate fell from around 5.6 children per woman in 1970 to roughly 2.6 by the late 1990s. This was a massive shift in how ordinary Indonesian families thought about sex, reproduction, and planning, even while the government simultaneously reinforced deeply conservative messaging about gender roles and premarital chastity. State-sponsored radio programs, community health posts known as posyandu, and door-to-door outreach workers normalized conversations about contraception in villages where such topics had rarely been discussed openly before, making Indonesia one of the most cited success stories in global family planning circles by the early 1990s, even as international observers noted the program's uncomfortable overlap with coercive practices in some regions during its earliest years. As the New Order matured through the 1980s and into the 1990s, Indonesian society began changing beneath the surface of its authoritarian calm. Television arrived in most households, bringing not just state propaganda, but glimpses of foreign lifestyles and changing global norms. Education expanded dramatically, and for the first time in the nation's history, large numbers of young women were finishing secondary school and even attending university, delaying marriage in the process. Urbanization pulled millions of young Indonesians away from tightly knit village communities, where every relationship was monitored by extended family and neighbors, into cities like Jakarta, Surabaya, and Bandung, where anonymity offered new kinds of freedom. Dating, in a Western sense, became more common among the urban middle class, even as public discourse continued to frame premarital romance as something to be hidden rather than acknowledged. Generational gaps widened sharply during this period. Surveys conducted in the 1990s already showed a measurable divide. Older Indonesians, raised under stricter adat and early Islamic education, held far more conservative views on premarital relationships than their children, who had grown up with television, expanding schools, and by the end of the decade, glimpses of the emerging internet. This generational tension would become one of the defining features of Indonesian sexual culture for the next 30 years, a tug of war between traditional expectations passed down through families and a rapidly modernizing urban youth culture absorbing global media. Magazines aimed at young women began openly discussing relationships and beauty in ways that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier, and Indonesian cinema, though still operating under state censorship boards that trimmed anything deemed too explicit, increasingly explored themes of romance, infidelity, and youthful rebellion, offering audiences a mirror, however filtered, of the changes already underway in daily life. Then came 1998, and with it, the single biggest transformation in this entire story, the fall of Suharto and the beginning of the Reformasi era. The Asian financial crisis had devastated the Indonesian economy, and mass protests forced Suharto to resign after 32 years in power. What followed was an explosion of political and social freedom unlike anything Indonesia had experienced. Press censorship collapsed, political parties multiplied, and, crucially for this story, decentralization handed significant legal authority to provincial and district governments, including the ability to pass local regulations, some of which incorporate elements of Islamic law. This decentralization produced one of the most striking contradictions in modern Indonesian history. In the same years that national politics grew more pluralistic and democratic, the province of Aceh, granted special autonomy partly to end a long separatist conflict, implemented its own version of Islamic criminal law starting in 2003, including public caning for offenses ranging from gambling to consumption of alcohol to consensual relationships outside marriage, and later, same-sex relations. Meanwhile, dozens of other districts across the country passed so-called morality regulations, covering everything from curfews for women to dress codes, even though these areas remained under the national secular legal system. Indonesia was fragmenting, legally and culturally, into a country where your rights and restrictions could depend heavily on which province you lived in. A young couple holding hands in a public park might face no legal consequence whatsoever in Jakarta or Bali, while the same behavior 1,000 miles away in Banda Aceh could, at least on paper, expose them to public caning under Sharia-based bylaws enforced by a dedicated religious police force known as the Wilayatul Hizbah. Nowhere else in Southeast Asia did democratization and religious conservatism advance so visibly side by side within the borders of a single nation. At the national level, the post-Suharto period also saw the passage of the 2008 anti-pornography law, a deeply controversial piece of legislation that broadly defined pornography to include not just explicit material, but also public behavior deemed to incite sexual desire. Critics, including feminist organizations and cultural groups from Bali and Papua, warned it could be used to police traditional dress, indigenous customs, and artistic expression. Supporters argued it was necessary to protect public morality in an increasingly open media environment. The law passed, but enforcement remained inconsistent and geographically uneven, a pattern that would define Indonesian sexual politics for the next 2 decades. Strict laws on paper, unevenly, and often selectively applied in practice. In Papua and parts of Bali, local leaders publicly objected that traditional dress worn during ceremonies could technically fall under the law's broad definitions, while in practice prosecutors rarely pursued such cases, focusing instead on commercial pornography distribution, which remained the law's primary target. By the 2010s, Indonesia had entered a new phase entirely, shaped less by domestic politics and more by global technology. Smartphone penetration exploded, and by the middle of the decade, Indonesia had become one of the largest social media markets on the planet, with tens of millions of active users on platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and later TikTok. This changed the sexual landscape in ways no law could fully anticipate. Dating apps gained traction among the urban middle class. Online communities allowed LGBTQ Indonesians, long forced into near total invisibility, to find each other and organize, even as visibility brought new risks of harassment and legal targeting. Comprehensive national survey data from this era painted a genuinely complicated picture. Indonesia's Demographic and Health Survey and other research found that a growing minority of unmarried young people reported having had premarital sex, a figure that climbed steadily across successive surveys even as public rhetoric around chastity remained as strict as ever. This gap between private behavior and public morality became one of the defining features of contemporary Indonesian society, a nation where sexual conservatism was the official language. But lived experience, especially among younger and urban Indonesians, told a more varied story. Reproductive health also entered public conversation in new ways during this period, as non-governmental organizations expanded access to sexual health education and HIV awareness campaigns in urban centers, even as conservative lawmakers periodically challenged school-based curricula that mentioned contraception or anatomy in anything beyond the vaguest terms, leaving Indonesia with one of the more fragmented approaches to sex education anywhere in the region. At the same time, backlash against LGBTQ visibility intensified sharply after 2016, when a wave of statements from government ministers and a moral panic, amplified by national media, led to a marked increase in raids on private gatherings, arrests under vague public order statutes, and proposed legislation that would have criminalized same-sex conduct nationally. Human rights organizations documented a chilling effect, with LGBTQ Indonesians reporting greater fear of violence and discrimination than in the previous decade, even as international rights bodies pushed back. This period revealed something important. Indonesia's growing connectivity to the global internet cut both ways, exposing citizens to more liberal ideas from abroad, while also fueling domestic backlash from conservative and religious movements who saw those same global trends as a threat to national identity. Several universities briefly banned LGBTQ student groups from campus. A handful of local governments floated their own bylaws targeting same-sex behavior, even without a national mandate. And prominent religious councils issued public statements framing the entire debate as a matter of defending Indonesian identity against foreign cultural influence, language that would echo directly into the drafting of the National Criminal Code just a few years later. Which brings us to the modern era, and to the law that opened this video. In December 2022, after literally decades of on and off drafting stretching back to the 1960s, Indonesia's parliament finally passed a sweeping new criminal code, known as the KUHP, intended to fully replace the old Dutch-era code still technically in force after more than a century. Among its most debated provisions were articles criminalizing sex outside marriage and unmarried cohabitation, carrying penalties of up to 1 year and 6 months in prison, respectively. After a 3-year transition period meant to let citizens and institutions adjust, the code officially took effect on January 2, 2026. Crucially, these provisions function as what legal experts call complaint offenses, meaning police can only investigate if a spouse, parent, or child of the accused files a formal report. Neighbors, hotel staff, or members of the public cannot trigger a prosecution. Supporters, including the country's law minister, framed the code as a long overdue assertion of legal independence from colonial-era legislation and a reflection of contemporary Indonesian values. Critics, including Amnesty International and numerous domestic civil society groups, warned that its broad and vague language, covering not just private morality but also criticism of the president and government institutions, opens the door to selective enforcement and abuse. The code also retained the death penalty, though with a new 10-year probationary mechanism that can convert a death sentence into life or a lengthy prison term for good behavior, expanded blasphemy provisions, carrying up to 5 years for deviation from recognized religious teachings, and preserved a general ban on abortion while formalizing exceptions for medical emergencies and pregnancies resulting from rape within the first 12 weeks. Notably, an earlier draft provision that would have separately criminalized consensual gay sex was dropped before final passage, following pressure from civil society groups, a detail that both LGBTQ advocates and conservative lawmakers point to for very different reasons when arguing about what the law does or doesn't represent. The numbers around modern Indonesian attitudes reveal just how contested this territory really is. Polling consistently shows strong majority support, particularly outside major cities, for laws restricting sex outside marriage, reflecting the country's deep religious identity. Yet, at the very same time, dating apps continue to see enormous engagement among Indonesia's roughly 280 million people, a majority of whom are under 35. Social media platforms host enormous, often anonymous, communities discussing relationships, sexuality, and reproductive health with a candor that would have been unthinkable in earlier decades. Indonesia's youth, in other words, are living inside two systems simultaneously: an increasingly restrictive formal legal architecture and an increasingly open, globally connected information environment, and the tension between the two shows no sign of resolving anytime soon. Content creators on TikTok and YouTube regularly discuss relationships, breakups, and modern dating culture to audiences of millions, blending entertainment with an implicit normalization of romantic experiences that official discourse still treats as taboo, while religious influencers with comparably massive followings push back with their own vision of piety and restraint. And both sides now compete for the attention of the same enormous youth audience on the very same platforms. So where does this all lead? Legal scholars inside Indonesia are divided. Some believe the new criminal code's complaint-based structure will keep prosecutions rare in practice, functioning mostly as a symbolic assertion of religious and national values rather than a tool of mass enforcement, similar to how existing morality laws in certain provinces have been applied selectively for years. Others warn that even rarely enforced laws can have an outsized chilling effect, discouraging open relationships, complicating unmarried cohabitation for the country's growing urban workforce, and creating new vulnerabilities for women and LGBTQ Indonesians who may already face family or social pressure. The tourism industry, a major pillar of the national economy, has expressed concern about how the law's existence, even if rarely applied to foreigners, might shape international perceptions of the country. Meanwhile, demographic trends point toward continued urbanization, rising education levels, particularly among women, and deepening internet penetration. All forces that have historically pushed Indonesian sexual norms toward greater openness, even when the law moved the other way. The most likely future, according to many observers, isn't a single national consensus, but a continuation of the pattern that has defined Indonesia since 1998, a fragmented, contested landscape where formal law grows stricter even as informal social practice continues to diversify, province by province, generation by generation. Some analysts point to neighboring Malaysia and parts of the Middle East as cautionary examples of how morality laws, once written into a criminal code, tend to persist for decades, regardless of shifting public attitudes, simply because repealing them becomes politically costly for any future government. Others note that Indonesia's courts have in the past quietly narrowed the practical scope of controversial laws through judicial interpretation, suggesting that KUHP's harshest provisions may eventually be softened in application even if they remain on the books. Here's the thread connecting 1945 to 2026. Indonesia's sexual history has never been a straight line from restriction to freedom or from tradition to modernity. It has been a pendulum, swinging between colonial law, religious revival, authoritarian family planning, democratic decentralization, and now a fresh wave of legal conservatism, all while ordinary Indonesians quietly build private lives that don't always match the official story. The most surprising takeaway might be this: the very same generation that grew up with more access to global culture, education, and information then any generation in Indonesian history is now coming of age under one of the strictest sexual morality laws the country has passed in decades. Two forces, openness and restriction, are accelerating at the same time, in the same country, in the same year, and how that tension resolves over the next decade may say as much about the future of religion, technology, and personal freedom worldwide as it does about Indonesia itself. Do you think this transformation improved Indonesian society? Or did it create new challenges the country hasn't fully reckoned with yet? Whatever your answer, one thing is certain. This story is far from finished, and Indonesia's next chapter is still being written by the same young generation caught in the middle of it. Share your honest opinion below.